Let's take a look how we can create this drag and drop functionality in React hooks. I just cleaned up some of that create React app boilerplate that comes with a new project. And now that we have a clean slate to work with, I want to create a structure first. So just create container with all the groups, and then all the groups with items inside of those groups, and then those items that we can shuffle around, drag them around. So let's do that first. So I'm just gonna create several divs. First one I'll just call, let's say, drag and drop. Inside of this guy, we'll just make another div and call it DND group. And inside of a group, we'll add another div, call it DND item. So the item is going to be responsible for all the content inside of it that we'll be dragging around. Okay, and then inside of item is going to be whatever we choose to be in there. So for instance, maybe a custom component or something inside. For that purpose, I'll just create another div that has maybe, let's say another paragraph inside, and we'll just say item inside of it so that we have some extra stuff there to look at. Now I'm gonna go ahead and remove some of the CSS that came with create React app. So we want this to be kind of top left, so I don't think we need all the alignments, as well as the direction column. So let's just comment this out really quick. Okay, so our item is now top left. Now let's take a look at the container. So we're looking at this drag and drop. I'll just copy that really quick. And I want to use a CSS Grid. I'm not necessarily really familiar with it, so I'd like to practice and just use that. And I think in this case will give us some flexibility, even though there's some edge cases that we need to think about. So we'll say it's going to be a CSS Grid. We'll give it width 100%, whatever it's inside, as well as height. Then we'll say, so we want to create columns for whatever the opening that we have. So currently we have this screen, so I want to divide this screen in columns. So to create these automatic columns, depending on what is the size of your viewport, it's called grid template columns, and we can just say repeat, and inside of repeat we can pass autofill and then the size of our column. So I'll say maybe, let's say 300 pixels. And now I believe the text is centered. So what we can do is just open up this guy. Let me just close the console here so we have a little bit more space here to look at things. So if I open up oh no, never mind. This is our header. Here you go. So in this case, we only have two columns. You can kind of see where the blue indicates the two different columns. So in this viewport, we were only able to create two columns for that 300 pixel width. So let's say if we would change this to like maybe 100 and go look at the drop, you can see that if we had 100 pixel width columns, we'll be able to have 6 of them here, but we'll go back to 300. That's what we want to do. So we have 2 columns, and then I think this guy item, the text in the item, is aligned. I believe that the text align center. Yeah, so text align center, because I believe everything inside of our div app is centered. So we'll have to play around and remove that, override some of those styles. So our grid is more or less done. The only thing I guess we should still, well, we can revisit that once we hit it. So now let's see groups. So a group is basically that column. So let's say DND, I think we called it DND group. And we'll say that background color for it is going to be a little bit lighter than this dark background for the app header. So we'll just pick it, and then VS Code gives you ability to pick something from the color picker. So we'll pick something lighter in the same shade, and then, well, we can save it really quick so we can see. So here you go, we have that, but it's really tucked into that left top. So I would say maybe our drag and drop, the container should have a padding, and let's say give it half a rem as a padding. Here you go. So it kind of a little bit away from all the edges. So next thing, I like to round off the corners. I think it looks a little bit neater. So we'll just give it a border radius 5 pixels. That's usually my choice. So we can see we have a little bit of a radius there. So far so good. Now let's say an item, we want the item to be white in this specific case. You know, obviously you would pick whatever you want. So D&D item, I think that's what I called, pretty sure. Yeah, D&D item. So we'll say background color white. Oops. Color, so we'll do the color, we'll do the same dark one here. We could use black, but I think that's fine. So now if we save it, we see that the item, now item is also all the way to the edges. So I want to change that a little bit. So I would say the group is gonna have a padding of also maybe half a rem. Okay, so now this guy's a little bit away from it. We can also say that, well, I want this item to be at least some kind of height. So let's give it a minimum height of, let's say, 150 pixels. And let's do some borders, border radius, I mean. Give it another 5 pixels to kind of round it off. We're almost there. That text is kind of weird, and I believe if we inspect it, we'll see that there's padding from the P text, and I'd like to get rid of it. So I'll just blank it and hit everything inside of that item. I'll just say item, and I'll hit a star, and I'll say anything inside of item element will have no margins. And this might not be exactly what we want, but currently that's fine. So now it fixed it up. Also, we'll say everything, well, for now we can say that. Text align, let's just do text align start. So that text is, do we? No, maybe we want to center it completely. So in that case, item, no, let's keep it centered, at least to the top. If we would want this guy like centered absolutely in the container, maybe we could use just a flex box. So let's say flex, justify content, center, and then align item center as well. But I believe it's not gonna work because the item, what we're setting is, it's not exactly the content of that guy. So D&D item, this guy, so this guy flex, I don't know if it, D&D item, I'm doing completely wrong place. So let's remove this and add this to the item. Let's see, here you go. So it's absolutely positioned there. Maybe we want to make that bold. That's fine. I think that's okay. We'll just leave it like this. Maybe font weight bold. That's not the ideal place to add the styling because every single text is going to be bold there. So we would need to be more specific about which element, but for now I think for this demo I think that's fine. We can keep just these general styles on it. Okay, so that's fine. So now let's take a look how this would look with more items in it, so that we're not only basing how it looks on a single item. So let's say I'm gonna copy paste this. I'll say that's item 1, item 2. Now we see that they're touching together. So we want the same little gap here, what I think we call it the half a rem between them. So in that case, we'll have to use a couple selectors and D&D item, and I'll say not, and I'll say last of type. So last of type. So I'm just basically saying that as long as it's not the last item in the sequence of them, of those D&D items, I'm gonna give it a margin bottom 0.5 rem. And we'll have this gap right here at 0.5 because this first item is not the last one, so it gets it. The second one is the last one and it doesn't get that styling. So we're looking good with just a couple items in the same group. Now, what if we make a second group? So let's just add another group with 2 more. So you can kind of see that there's kind of the similar problem here, is that we have this no gap here between the 2 groups. It's kind of the similar thing as we did here with the not selector, but since these groups are items within CSS Grid, we can use gap to give this little gutter per se. So we can just go back to our template columns, drag and drop. Yeah, so we can say gap, and it used to be called, I think, grid gap, but it's now giving me a little, here you go, you see it's crossed out. I think they're deprecating that that property, so I think it's now just going to be called gap. So 0.5 rem, and now we have this little gap here between the 2 groups. Now another thing that I can kind of see happening, if we have, let's see if we can grab another group and just copy paste it once again, but make it empty so that we don't have any items. And the reason I'm looking at that is because if this guy's empty, I believe it's gonna be, so yeah, let's see if we can get this guy a little bit bigger. Yeah, so I had to expand my window a little bit because this one was wrapping and going into the next row to fill it up, and that's something we might need to handle as well if we get into it. But since I'm shrinking all the space for you guys to see the examples as well as the code, it's kind of tricky to balance. But anyways, it's also dynamic text. We might want to set it an actual font size rather than dynamics text that's coming from React boilerplate styles. Anyways, so you can see that this new group is expanding to the same size as any of these guys. So I think if I would add a 3rd item in the first one, the second group and 3rd group would also adjust the heights. So let's just quickly do that. And I don't think that that's the look that I want. So let's say if I do 3 here, yeah, exactly. So this space is now kind of filled in because these guys stretch to whatever the biggest column is. They just fill in that space. And to do that, to avoid that, we can go to our drag and drop items and just align them. Oops, just deleted it. So here we can say align items and just say something like start, and that should take care of it. Yeah. So let me resize this, and I think we're in a pretty good shape. Obviously, unfortunately, that 3rd group is going down, so I'm just gonna get rid of it for this example. Maybe we still want to add group names here at the top. So in each group, I'm just gonna add a div, give it like group title, and say group 1, and I'll just do the same thing for the other group. Let's see how it looks. Yeah, well, we can target and say for group title, let's do text align left, maybe start. left. I'm not really sure what start and left would be. Anyways, let's do left. Okay. The only other thing is probably give it margin bottom half a rem so that the gaps are kind of similar across the board. Yeah, and I think that's good enough, right? I think we're okay. I wonder if this, yeah, they're also kind of dynamic. So if we're shrinking this, let's do this. So for our items, we said no margin, and let's give it font size, maybe 1 rem, 1.2 rem, and then the group title, I'll give it font size 1.5 maybe. Okay, so now these shouldn't be dynamic. Yep, so now we got rid of that dynamic part. Okay, so I think we're good with that. So now obviously we're not gonna just drop and copy paste all this stuff. Let's create our pretend data set. So let's say we're gonna structure this in the way. So if we think about it, we're gonna have a list of groups, and then inside of each group we're gonna have a list of items. So we'll just create an array, and each array will have an object. We'll give it, object will have, let's say, group name, or we can just say name, or title. I think we call that group title, so let's call it title, and we'll give this group 1 as a title, and then we'll say items inside of it is another array, and we'll make this array very simple. Mind you, this array could be another array of objects, but in this case I'll just make it 1, 2, maybe 3, and then we'll just copy this whole object, make this guy a group 2, and let's do 4 and 5. So just make this guy only have 2 items, and I think that would do. So we'll create a new component for this, but for now we can just take a look how can we iterate through this. So we can say data.map, and we'll say we're gonna take a group as well as the index, so we'll call it group index, group I, and we're going to well, we can return it, right? So we can just say, come on, why is all this text there? Okay, so we're gonna, for each group, we're just gonna take the group, right? So we'll say div dnd group. So we have that. Mind you, before we do that, we need to wrap it with the dnd drag and drop. So boom, and let's close it here. Okay, so this guy is now closed. We can also get rid of this stuff. Just comment it out for now, just in case I need to refer to it. And then, so we now a group, and then inside of that, we're gonna iterate through our group items. So we have this group guy. We can say group dot items dot map. Do the same thing, except here we're gonna call it item and then item I for the item index. And well, we're once again returning, so we can say div, and we called it dnd item, and inside of here we'll just pass item, yeah, just item, since our item is a string right here, so we can directly pass an item. Here we need to also pass a key, and just pass the item here, and for iterating our groups we'll just pass another key for group.title. Why are you auto-completing nonsense? Group.title. Let's see, did we make any boo-boos? No, it looks like we got it all done. And just for fun right now, so this key, if we give it a draggable true, so we can either say draggable true or just draggable, which is means the same thing, we can see now that if we drag something, it leaves kind of like a ghost image. So we'll work with that. So I just wanted to go through it, show the very beginnings of it, and we'll switch gears and go into making components and rest of the logic that we have planned. I got this graph to just kind of go through the sequence of events that we'll need to do for us to achieve this drag and drop functionality. So initial state, this is the state where cards just sitting there being pretty, doing nothing. So drag start is when we grab a card and start dragging it. So this is the part that we initialize a lot of logic. So at this point we say, we take note which card we're starting to drag so that we can compare with the target area and say if they're not the same, we should swap them so that they switch places and rearrange. Then we're going to initialize drag in listener, and we're going to initialize just drag in listener through just a regular DOM API. So we'll just say, event.target at event listener. And the reason for that is because if we attach it the React way or the synthetic events, I believe called, it's somewhat unpredictable when it fires. So if nothing re-renders within the parent node structure, it's okay. But if we switch groups, then we'll fire drag end whenever that happens, and that's not what we expect or want. So we'll just do it regular DOM API rather than through using React way. And then at the same time, we'll need to initialize some kind of styles for the card that we're dragging, so it looks a little bit different than the rest of the cards. And initialize drag enter listeners. So drag enter listeners are the listeners whenever we drag over our card over the different target card, or in some cases could be a different target group, because sometimes a group could be completely empty and we still want to drop a card, and if there's no other cards there, we need to attach it to the group itself rather than the card, so we can handle that edge case. And then once we get into drag enter, this is the point where we actually drag our card over a different card, and then we'll say, well, these two are different cards, that therefore we should rearrange our data so that the current drag card is now swapping places with the target thing. And we're just going to rearrange state and do couple things to make sure that we're keeping track of current card and target card. And then once we release the mouse button, that's when we expect this drag end to fire. And at this point, we can get rid of the drag end listeners as well as drag enter listeners, since they're not very of use at this point, as well as clean up the styles that we had for dragged card. All right, so let's move some stuff around. I currently just am sitting in the app.js. I just want to go ahead and move all this stuff from our app file into different file. And before I forget, I see I missed our title, so let me quickly put that in here. It's group.title, right? Let me just make sure it works. Okay, so let me copy this. I'm gonna open up, create a new folder, call it components, add another file, call it drag and drop.js. I'm gonna import our React from React. Quickly just throw something together for now. Function drag and drop. And for now, we're just going to return an empty string. Export default. Drag and drop. Import this guy. Components. Oh, how do I love autocomplete. And then we copied this guy, so technically we could get rid of all this stuff so it doesn't clutter it. Drag and drop. Make sure we save it, nothing breaks. Now inside of this guy, let's drop in our values. So data, well, we can pass data as a data prop. Data. Now in here, let's destructure the data from it, and we're back to where we were. Now, mind you, this data we wanted kind of so we're going to manipulate, and we want to see those changes. So currently it's just hard-coded in his constant. So these changes will never take place. So what we're going to do is just initialize state with this data prop. So we'll grab our use state, and right here we're gonna say, well, we're gonna call this a list, and set list, and set state, and we'll just pass this data here. So we'll just initialize it with the data use state, sorry, not set state. Going back between class components and functional components with hooks gets kind of confusing here and there. Okay, so now we're no longer referring to this data, but list. Let's make sure this all works. Okay, so we're good. So we initialize this guy. Let me just close this panel so we have more space. Okay, so we have our list in a state that we can update and see changes. So now we currently have this draggable guy. So let's create another method or function to handle the drag start. We'll call it handle drag start. And here we'll say on drag start, we'll give it handle drag start. Right, and here we'll just console.log drags, need a string, drag starting. So now save it. If we start dragging something, we see that we fire that function as we're trying to do it. Now, we said we want to get an item that we're working with, the item that we're currently dragging. So we can do is simply make this into a function that's gonna fire this function, pass event, as well as we're gonna pass the group index and item index. So while we're iterating through groups, we also have this group index, as well as while we're iterating through items, we have item index. And if we look back quickly in our data structure, we see that we have an array of objects, which is our groups, and then inside of our group we have items, which is an array of, in this case, just simple strings, but could be anything. So to get this specific item, let's say we started drag this number 1, so we want to get kind of like coordinates to this guy. So the way we get this is by getting, well, which group is it in by index, right? So we say, well, it's 0th index, that means it's group 1, and then 0th item index, which is this one. So basically what we're getting here is passing the coordinates per se to that specific item. And here we can say, let's console log. So we just drop this, let's call it params. Params. So now if we start dragging, we should start seeing these params that we talked about. So in this case, I'm grabbing in first group the last item, which is 0th group, and then the second item index, so 0, 1, 2, right? Okay, so that's what we want. While we're at it, we want to set these items in some kind of like a variable that we can keep around. So in that case, we'll need to use ref, and use ref is something that stays constant between re-renders. So that's kind of the reason for using use ref, and we'll just call it drag item, and we'll just use ref. We won't pass anything there, so to kind of just initiate it, and just to set something to the use ref initiated variable, we'll just see drag item dot current, and we'll just set it to whatever we want. In this case, we'll just set it to params. Okay, so now every time we drag, we set this drag item to those params. So now we have basically directions to this specific item every time we drag it around. So next thing is, well, let's style this specific card that we're dragging. Let's style this card being something different than just the same white, right? So, well, to do that, we need to kind of make some changes into to one of our states so that we see some kind of re-render so that we can initiate that style change, right? So what I'll do is just create another state, right? So in this, I'll just call it dragging. So it's kind of like true, false. Is it dragging? Yes, no. Set dragging. And use state. And by default, I'll make it false. So by default, we're not dragging. And here we'll say, after we set this current item, dragging item, we can say that set dragging to true. We're basically saying, hey, we're actually dragging right now. And while we're there, okay, so let me just clean up some of this stuff so that we can see it better. Give it some different lines. Okay, so here what we want to do, here currently we just have a static class name, D&D item. So what I can do is basically say, do a little ternary expression and say, well, check if dragging is true, right? So if dragging is true, we can, for instance, run a function that returns different string, and that string will have the different styles, right? So let's say get styles, we'll call that function. Otherwise, we're just gonna return back the same regular D&D item. Now let's make this new get styles function. And get styles, let's say we could, well, we can return, if I can spell it, let's say return current, which is going to be the indicator for the card to be styled differently than D&D-item, plus D&D item. Because if we are dragging, we're just getting whatever's inside of here, which in that case is simply this, right? So it's not going to be duplicate here. D&D item by itself is only available when we're not dragging. Okay, so in that case, we're just going to pass current, right? So let's save it. Nothing is happening because we have nothing styled for current, right? So now let's open up our little panel, app CSS. Let's add something for current. And all I want to do is just give it background color the same as the actual background here in the behind. So we'll just give it this darker color. And you'll see that this stuff is kind of all dark. So, oops, drag and drop. So when I start dragging, everything becomes that style, right? Which makes sense because we're saying that, hey, is it dragging? If it's dragging, just do this, get styles. And if we look at get styles, it just simply returns styles for every single item that has been iterated, right? So what we could do is just simply say here, we could just pass the group I and item I. So now we'll say inside of here, we'll say, well, if we're group I equals our drag item group I and drag item I is equals this item I that we passed, we know that that's the specific item we started dragging, and therefore we can only style this one. So here what we can say is if we'll make it kind of long and we can kind of short it later, but well, we can say this. Let's say const item, let's say current item equals drag item dot current, right? So now we're getting these params that we set it right here. So we're grabbing that guy. And then we'll say, also we can get params here. So we'll just grab these params that we're passing here. And here we can say if current item dot group I equals what do we set, params. No, please don't autocomplete nonsense. Params dot group I, and it's also current item I equals params dot item I. So this is basically saying only style return something only for this condition, which is both indices are equals to whatever we're dragging, right? Okay, so in that case, we'll say, well, we're going to return this string right here, right? Otherwise, we're just going to return the same thing, just D&D item. Now let's see how that's going to look. So let's refresh it. Okay, now release it, but once we start dragging other stuff, nothing is happening. And the reason is for it is because we set this to true, and this is the only time that we're kind of making changes to the state that makes re-renders happen. We never toggled this back to false to cause another re-render to reset this. And therefore, whenever we're going back and setting it to true, it's already true. So we didn't change anything. So we never re-rendered this and never asked for this change, right? So in that case, what we need to handle is during drag end, we need to do some cleanup, right? So like once we release the mouse, we don't really need this to be true, as well as we don't really need this to be anything either, because we just want it to be set to something like null. So as I mentioned before, what we'll have to do here is attach drag end to the node itself rather than use some kind of setup here inside of our return function, where we could say, for instance, you know, here we'd say, well, on drag end, and we give it a method. We can't really do that here because it misbehaves occasionally, and that's really not what we're trying to do. Well, it's unpredicted behavior and we'll break things. So here what we'll do is, first thing is we'll create another ref, and this ref will basically store the reference to this specific node. So we'll say drag node, right? Just call it like this and use ref. And here we'll just say drag node dot current equals e dot target. E dot target is basically the node that we're playing with. And once we're done, we just set this reference. We can just say drag node dot current. We can say add event listener. We'll say drag end, and we'll pass a method. And this method could, let's say we're going to call handle drag end. Right, so we'll just quickly create this method, const handle drag end, and here we'll say console.log ending drag. All right, and let's see if we can. So I'm dragging it and then releasing it, and nothing happens, right? So why is nothing happening currently? Oh, because I misspelled drag end. Drag end. All right, so let's try this again. Release it, ending drag, right? Ending drag. So with that in place, we can actually do something about cleanup. So not only do we say grab these guys and say this is now null, we don't need this, we don't need this guy either. Then we say, well, we don't really care for that to be true. We want it back to its default state, the initial state. And at this point, we can also remove this listener that's listening to drag end, right? So here, instead of add, we'll say remove. So now we have a way to clean things up. Now release it. Oh, get a little. Oh, so this guy, let's move this stuff a little bit down because we're trying to remove a listener after we cleared it. So it would make sense, right? Release it. Now see that whatever we're dragging is the color we want. And once we're releasing, we reset the state. Now, if you can see that we're styling our card right away, and once we start dragging, we get this dark, basically that current black, well, very dark styling for that card instead of this white. So what we want to do is give us set timeout before, and I'm sorry, with the 0, basically making this more like asynchronous so that once we start dragging, we get this style, and then we set this dragging to true in kind of an asynchronous manner that changes the styling of it right away. So here, let's try this again. Here, so you see I still have this guy as previous styling, but the background is now changed to what we wanted. So yeah, so that's how we're going to solve that thing, right? Okay, so styling is more or less done. Our cleanup is more or less done. Now the only thing left is swapping places whenever we scroll over other cards, right? So currently we're not handling anything there yet. So next step would be to add another function, and let's say call it handle drag enter. And this is the method or function that will fire whenever we grab this guy and scroll over other cards. Well, we'll start with other cards for now, and then we'll adjust for groups in case the group is completely empty. So here we can say, well, if we start dragging, right, we need all our items to list to add this event listener to themselves, right? So what we can do is go into our this card that we're dragging and say on drag enter, and here we'll do another ternary expression. Well, we'll say, well, is dragging currently happening? Is dragging true? If it is true, we can pass this method, and console.log, we'll just make it something so that entering, we'll say entering drag, just so that we can see this happening. And we'll say, well, then just pass this guy, otherwise we're not going to pass anything, right? So now if we save this and start dragging, you'll see that right away it fires enter and drag because we just added it, and I believe that's how events will fire right away. And now if I'll scroll over another item, we'll see that enter drag fired again and again and again as I'm entering all these items that accepts that, or listens to that event, right? Once I release, it goes back, but like this, right? Okay. Another thing is currently we don't know which item we hovered over. It just says we know we hovered over. So we can replace this once again with a function that passes an event as well as our group I, and item I. And we can just say that these guys are wait, where were we? E, and let's say params. Stay consistent. So, and here we'll say params. So now we also get coordinates for the item we're scrolling over. So I think you guys are probably getting it where we're going with this. So now we have an item that we are dragging plus the item that we're dragging over, the target item. So here what we can do is, first of all, since this fires right away, let me clear it, like the second I start dragging, the entering drag fires. That means we get this drag starting with the same coordinates as entering drag going off. So first thing is to check if they are the same, don't bother doing anything. And to check for that same, we could use these coordinates in a way, but I think we have a little bit simpler way to use is to check is we have this reference to this node. So we can say if this node is not equals e.target that we're firing here, then we're good to go. And that, let's try doing that. So we could say if e.target is not equals drag node.current, then we'll say that we'll just console log something here really quick saying target is not the same, so that we can just see. So I start dragging, you see that that console never fires. So I can go back in, it fires, but that code block is not. Now let's see if we go other items. See, now other items are saying that, hey, this is not the same as this. Therefore, we can do something special here. Okay, so in that case here, what we can do is basically set lists, right? So we have everything, all the data that we need to make the changes. And I can grab const drag item. So I'll just say current item. I think I used current item for a previous one, and I'll just use drag item dot current. So now we have this guy, and here what we can say is, well, set list, and we'll use with a kind of a callback. It's not really a callback, it's just so that we can make the change in the whole set state set list method. So here what we'll say is old list. It's kind of similar to set state, but it's not really, because it's kind of, anyways, I'll just continue with it. So first thing, I want to make a copy of this old list. So this old list is basically list right there. So to make a copy, I'll do like a little cheat, and I'll say, well, let me have new list that I'm gonna manipulate. And to get this new list, the simplest way, mind you, not the most efficient, but simplest way for me to get a complete deep copy, right, is to say json.parse and then call json.stringify and pass this old list. So here I'll be able to grab a deep copy of this object of old list. If I did just destructuring using, you know, something like this where I'd said new list, I would only make a shallow copy, and I would prefer to use deeply cloned copy, right? So now we can manipulate this new list, and to set this list, mind you, at the end we need to return new list. So that's at the end, right? So let's manipulate this new list. So we'll say let's target the item that we're targeting, right? So not the currently dragged one, but the one that we just rolled over, right? Scrolled over. So we're gonna target that array. So we'll say new list, we'll grab params group I. So now we'll get to the target group index, and we'll say items.splice. And what we're doing is basically shuffling around items using splice. And we'll say, well, first thing in a splice, if we want to move something, right, we need to say index of one item, so like some index of item that we're trying to replace, then say if we're deleting anything at that, so we say 0, and then the index of the item that we're going to replace with, so let's say 2. So what we'll do in this case, we would take the first and flip it with the second. without removing anything in between. I know it's a little strange, but this is the quickest way for us to accomplish what we're trying to do. So here we can say, well, if we take our params dot item I at 0th, and now this might get a little bit convoluted, but we have to make sure that we're with the same group, right? So we need to, in between groups should work, within the group should work. So that's why we're using all these relative paths, let's say, and maybe absolute paths. So we'll say here, we'll say new list, and we'll go to now current item, group I, dot items, and we're going to splice this guy, but in this case we're going to remove this from that place, right, and return it. So items dot splice, and we'll say let's remove at index, and we'll remove single item. So we'll say whatever the x index is and remove one item. So the x is basically our currently dragged item. So we can just say current item dot item I. Now that will just remove an item. But this method, splice, will also return a list if you set it to return at something as an array, an item array. So if we take the 0th item, since we're removing one item from this list, we'll be able to get this. So now if we point at 0th, we should be able to make the changes here. So now, since this technically should work, and we'll have to revisit because this is kind of something that I needed to think quite a bit to make it kind of one-liner. And here we can say, well, now since these guys are flipped their places, the current item is no longer the current item. Now the current item became the target item. So here I would say, what is it? Drag item that current is going to be equals params, right? Well, let's try and see how this works. So we grab this, scroll over something, and it works within the group. Now if we go another group, that works as well. Now in this case, what I just did, I just grabbed everything and moved to one group. If I try to go back here, there are 0 cards here for me to scroll over to be able to flip them or exchange the places. So we're not handling this case where there's 0 items there, right? So what we can do here is we're adding this drag enter listener only on the cards. So what we can do is add this listener to the group when it doesn't have any items in it. So what we can do here is say, let me once again kind of make it easier to see. We already made quite a lengthy splice here, so I'm gonna try to make it a little bit cleaner here. Okay, let's format it a little bit better. So here we can say on drag start, on drag enter, I believe, right? On drag enter. And we'll say, well, if we'll do the same thing, if we're dragging, we can say, well, if we're dragging and our items, so group dot item, is it items? I think it's items. Yes, group dot items dot length. So if currently I'm asking, is it if we're dragging and we have positive number of items, so group dot items dot length 0, which means that there's no items in the array, would be a falsy value. So this would fail. So we can just flip it and say, well, if there's something in group items, then let's add that handler. So we'll do handle drag enter, right? Otherwise, no. Now, mind you, we're not passing any values because we still need those params, right? Handle drag enter. We need these params to know where are we dragging it over. Well, in this case, we don't really have an item because there's 0 items. So we can say, we can just cut it. Once again, we'll make it a function that passes our event, and we'll fire this guy, pass event. And here what we can say is group I is group I, but since there's no items here, right? So at this point, we don't know which item we're doing, but we know that there's nothing there, right? So there's no other items. So obviously the very first item is going to be 0th. So item I could be by default set to 0. And in this case, if we drag everything here, we should be able to drag it back in there, right? So we can drag things between each other, and as long as, so this event listener for drag enter on the group only exists if there's nothing in there. So right now there's exist one. Now we scroll over, and now if we try to do that, it's not working because it doesn't exist. Okay, so here you go. We have our drag and drop between 2 different groups, and this is super cool because we can now basically just expand. Let's say we wanted more cards here. It would be just simple as just expanding this, right? So we could say now 6, 5, 6, 7, group 3, right? If we save this, now we have 3 groups that we can go in between, right? Which is kind of cool. We basically made our very primitive functionality for a combine board, right? So let's get rid of it. And we could say, for instance, if we don't really have any backend or anything like that, but we could use like local storage to save things, and they would stay persistent between refreshes and such. But I think that could be expanded if we really care to go in deeper, and I'll have to see if there's any want or need for that type of stuff. So glad I was able to go through this, and hope you guys enjoyed.